Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome. I'm very glad to have you here today. It's just a quick little lunch and learn. It's only about 15 minutes of instruction and then hopefully about 15 minutes for questions. So we've got a pretty small group here. If you do have questions at the end, you should be able to unmute yourself and just ask your questions, or if you're more comfortable, you can man them in the chat. I am Stephanie Roach with the Utah Parent Center. Utah Parent Center is a statewide nonprofit organization that helps families navigate special education. So we help you if you have issues understanding the process or working with your team or have questions in general about the process. Don't ever hesitate to call us. We would love to help you out with this, with your special education questions and issues. So Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 at any point, go ahead and give us a call and we can help you. So today, what we're going to talk about is college level assessments and college entrance exams for students who are in high school, and how your student can receive appropriate accommodations on these tests. So the first thing I want to just briefly talk about is accommodations and modifications in public school. So if your student has an IEP or a 504, this is probably something that you're already familiar with, but I wanted to briefly explain this so then we can talk about the differences. So when your child has an IEP or Section 504 plan, the accommodations and modifications on the plans apply to all appropriate settings in school. This includes homework, formal and informal tests, and any assignments that they may have. As you meet with your teams to discuss your child's strengths and weaknesses, it's important to work together to develop a comprehensive list of accommodations that are needed to help the student be successful in their education. So I just very briefly wanted to explain the difference between an accommodation and a modification. An accommodation is something that helps level the playing field for a student. They're generally provided in general education classes, although they can be provided also in special education. But a student, if they need an accommodation, it could be something like extended time to get homework done or assignments done, a quiet place to take a test, even things like accessing a building for a student who is visually impaired or has issues with mobility. All of those things could be considered accommodations. They just level that playing field in general education. A modification is when we start talking about specialized instruction. That's special education. So that would be modifying the method of the student, how they learn, changing maybe the depth or the breadth of the information that they're learning in a class. It goes beyond accommodations and goes into modifying that curriculum. So we have an entire workshop that talks about the difference between those two things. And I don't have time to get into all of that, but I just briefly wanted to share that so that you understand that what we're going to be talking about today is accommodations, because modifications and specialized instruction will not apply to college level exams or college entrance exams. The only thing that would apply would be accommodations. So those other things that kind of level that playing field. And what's important also to note that if your student only has a 504 and if they have an IEP, the accommodations are written usually as part of that document. So even though they're not specialized instruction and they are accommodations, they're almost always written into just that one document, and it covers both. But if your child only has a 504 plan, I just wanted to make sure everybody knows that it's not required to be written down. The plan just does not have to be formally written, but it is really important for the need for accommodations to be documented and for those accommodations to be used consistently in all situations where they're required. And there are a lot of reasons why this is important, but one of them is to make sure that we have an accurate picture of what the student needs as they prepare for what comes after public school. And part of that would be also preparing and having documentation that those accommodations are needed when we're getting ready to take these tests. When a student ends public school, either through receiving their regular diploma or aging out after a post-high school program, all IEP and Section 504 services end. So the public school services end either at graduation with a diploma or aging out through a post-high program. Modifications and specialized instruction on the IEP will not continue into any institutions of higher learning. However, many accommodations, either that were on the IEP or that were on a 504, may continue into higher education, employment, and potentially even housing. So again, this is a brief overview. I can answer questions at the end if you have them. And we have some dedicated training on these issues as they are pretty complex. So you can reach out to us and ask us about when those trainings might take place, or look on our training calendar on our website if you want to learn more about this. But I just wanted to kind of give you just a brief overview. The takeaway from this is that modifications or specialized instruction will not follow you from public education into higher education, but many accommodations can. Not all. It just doesn't usually look like a 504 plan that has been used in high school. It may not look the same, but many of those accommodations can follow you into higher education. So there are also some tests that your child may take in high school that wouldn't be considered in that same realm of the IEP and the 504. So when you have accommodations, like I said before, they follow you through all settings in school, but with some exams, they will not, the accommodations in the IEP or the 504 may not look the same. Some of those tests, such as the ACT or the SAT, are not administered by the high school, but they are administered by either the College Board or the ACT Board, other boards. And as a result, modifications on an IEP would not be applicable to these tests, but certain other accommodations may be permitted. In order for a student to be able to use an accommodation on this type of test, the student needs to have demonstrated a need for the accommodation in the past. That is why it's so critical for needed accommodations to be documented as soon as a student needs them, so this information can be provided to the various boards when accommodations are being requested. Okay, so when I mentioned before, even if that 504 is not written down, we need to have documentation that the student needs a particular accommodation, because that information has to be sent to these boards so they can determine whether or not the accommodation will be granted on these college level exams. All right, so the first test we're going to talk about is the ACT, the American College Test. So the ACT is a standardized test that determines a high school graduate's preparedness for college in 5 areas: math, English, reading, writing, and science. Many colleges require an ACT score in order to be eligible for admission into the college. So these tests are administered by the American College Test Incorporated. So it's just the name of the test, Incorporated. In order for the school to be able to request accommodations for your child to be used on this test, you have to sign permission. They cannot release your child's accommodations to the American College Test Incorporated unless you have signed permission to let them do that. So you have to make sure that you keep that in mind as you're approaching the time when your child's going to get ready to take that ACT, that you, before they can even consider submitting those accommodations, you have to give them permission. And they should be submitted a few months in advance, so that there's time for them to review and ask any questions that may come up and get any clarification that's needed. Usually a copy of the IEP or the 504 plan is sufficient to demonstrate eligibility. So if your child does have a plan and has been using those accommodations, most of the time that will be enough for them to be able to review what your child has been using and then grant that permission. The school almost exclusively will request accommodations for the ACT for you. So remember, I said it has to be done several months in advance and you have to sign permission. The reason I am really emphasizing this is because I want this to be on your radar starting, about this time, maybe even a little earlier, maybe in November of the year that your child is going to take that test. And if you are concerned about them receiving accommodations and haven't heard from their team to sign permission, it would be a good idea to reach out to them and say, hey, I understand my child's going to take the ACT in the spring. It takes a while for those accommodations to be approved by the American College Test Incorporated. Can I please sign consent so that those can be submitted? It should be upon the school to come to you to get that permission, but there have been instances where that hasn't happened. And so that's why I'm telling you to just keep it in the back of your mind. And if you're concerned about that, the time for the test is approaching, go ahead and reach out to them to ask if you can get that permission signed so those accommodations can be submitted. So accommodations are really very personal. It's impossible to list every single accommodation that a student might be eligible for, but some of the more common ones include large print test booklets, small group testing, medical supplies or food in a testing room, visual time signals, extended time, Braille, use of a scribe, testing over multiple days for students who may not be able to handle the whole test in one day, use of an approved bilingual dictionary for students who are speaking English as a second language, and translated test instructions, but not translated test questions. So the instructions can also be translated into a different language, but not the instructions. Again, those are just some ideas. They're not every accommodation that could be provided, but some of the things that may be. So now we're going to talk about the College Board. So the College Board administers several different tests, including the SAT, the PSAT, the College Level Examination Program, or otherwise known as the CLEP test, and then Advanced Placement Tests, AP tests. So the College Board administers all of these tests. And the good news is that if your child is taking both the SAT and an advanced placement class and wants to CLEP another class for college, the accommodations all come from the same place. So you don't have to reapply and reapply multiple locations. So these tests are all administered by the College Board. So the ACT test is administered by a different board. These are all administered by the College Board. Again, you have to sign permission with the school before they can submit the request for accommodations. They cannot do it without your permission. The request for accommodations can take up to 7 weeks. So like we talked about with the ACT, thinking about we're getting those accommodation requests done maybe November, December before the spring of the test, that would be another thing to think about starting about this time, is to get permission for those accommodations signed so that the school has it on their radar, especially because an AP test might not be as common for an AP teacher to know to submit an accommodation for a student. And so keep it on your radar, and you can be proactive and request some additional help with that, or just request that let them know that you want to sign consent so that those can be submitted in enough time to get those accommodations for your child's test. And again, just like with the ACT, in most cases, if the student is requesting the same accommodations used in an IEP or 504, no additional information is needed. And accommodations can include, but are not limited to, extended time, recording responses, use of a 4-function calculator, a human reader, pre-recorded audio, a large print test, magnification device, Braille, a screen reader, speech to text, and then other accommodations as well. So we're going to talk for a minute about International Baccalaureate. And I bring these up because there are several schools in the state that have International Baccalaureate programs, and students are still eligible for accommodations on these tests, just like they are any other college level exam. And so I wanted to bring it up. It might not be something you're familiar with, might not be something that your child participates in, but it's still helpful information to know if that is something that you would like your child to be considered for. So the formal tests for the International Baccalaureate are administered by International Baccalaureate. There are other tests throughout the year that would be administered by the school, but those formal tests are administered by International Baccalaureate. Again, you have to sign permission with the school before the request for accommodations can be submitted. And the accommodations request for those formal tests should be submitted in October for the May tests. So now we're even earlier than the ACT and the SAT. So if your child is participating in these tests around about October is when you're going to want to talk to the school to make sure that you sign consent so they can submit for those accommodations. The school does submit all accommodations, but they can be given throughout the course of study. So I'm not an expert in international baccalaureate tests. I did have a conversation with somebody who's involved in the program, but many tests throughout the school year can apply toward that international baccalaureate degree. Those accommodations that are written into a 504 or an IEP can be used for those informal assessments as well, but they don't have to be submitted necessarily to International Baccalaureate for approval. Those would just be traditional accommodations through your school. So some examples of accommodations can include additional time, rest breaks, a separate room or an alternate venue, a reader, a sign language interpreter, a calculator, or a scribe. And again, those are just examples. They're not a comprehensive list of accommodations that could be provided. All right, so that was super fast, just a crash course in accommodations, and I'm guessing that there will be a few questions. So let's go ahead and open it up to some questions now for about 15 minutes. Let me see how many people we have here now. We don't have that many, so if you would like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and speak the question out loud, or you can put it into the chat, whichever you prefer. Okay, so a question just came into the chat. How do we know if accommodations are written into the IEP? That's a great question. So like I said, most of the time accommodations on the IEP they're written as part of the IEP. I do know of 2 districts who have separate documents for an IEP and a 504. So if your student has an IEP, there would actually be 2 separate documents with the accommodations written on another document. But most of the time they will be written together. And everybody's program looks a little bit different as far as writing the IEP. So I don't know for sure exactly what section yours would be in, because I don't know which program your school or your district uses, but it will look like it will say services and accommodations, and there will just be a little section that will talk about whatever it is that your child is using. If they're using extended time or use of technology, a scribe, breaks, things like that, it will be listed as a separate section on your IEP. And then off to the side, it will list the frequency of that accommodation. Is it being used daily, weekly, as needed? So it will be the specific accommodation along with the frequency. If you're not sure where that is on your IEP, you can give us a call and we can kind of help you go through the document to see where it is and what that might look like. You are welcome. Are there any other questions? I was looking, so someone earlier said, is there a more comprehensive list of accommodations somewhere? Sometimes it's hard to know what to ask for. Ideas would be helpful. And that's a question we get quite frequently. And it's hard to know because every student is different. So really what it is think about the challenge that your child is having and what things could help them overcome that challenge. We're talking about mitigating measures, things that will, like I said, level that playing field. And accommodations, of course, have to be considered reasonable, but reasonable is very broad. So that can be painted with a very broad brush. But another suggestion that I give to parents when I talk to them about requesting accommodations is maybe talk to other parents of kids who have the same condition as your child and say, this is what my child is going through. Has there been anything that's really helped in school? And they may have an idea that you hadn't considered. And one other thing that can really be helpful as your child starts to get older, and we're talking about older kids here, if they're getting ready to take college entrance exams, college level exams, talk to them and just say, hey, you know, you have this disability. What would help you to feel like the playing field were being leveled? What would help you be able to do that work in a manner that you feel would be more consistent with your peers. And sometimes they may have a really great suggestion that we hadn't thought of. So trying to include them in the conversation can be really, really powerful, and can also help them learn how to advocate for themselves. Because at some point, my son actually turns 18 in 2 weeks, and I'm pretty terrified. He's going to be an adult, and I'm not the adult in the situation anymore, as far as the IEP goes. So my son will be in charge. And so we've been trying to help him advocate for himself for several years, but learn about his disability and the accommodations that he needs, so he can talk to his teachers about them and have a conversation when he feels like he needs to use an accommodation. And that can be really helpful even moving forward into college or career, whatever comes next after high school. Giving them the opportunity to practice in a safe place while they're still in school can just give them that extra little nudge and little confidence to continue to be able to do that moving forward. So I would really highly suggest involving your child and just asking them what they think is helpful. Okay, the next question. When trying to get accommodations for the ACT, what do they look at when considering what accommodations they will approve on the test? So what they're going to look at is what the student has been consistently receiving up to this point. So we want to have a history, we want to be able to show a history of why the accommodation is needed. And that can be just, brief documentation from a conversation, or, in an IEP, there are always notes. With a 504, it's a little different because of the rule that it not be written down. But I wanted to say one more thing about that really best practice is to write that 504 down. And most schools that I've worked with, I don't think I've ever worked with one school where they didn't write down the 504. So I think most schools really do understand that need and do it. But as a parent, you can definitely advocate for that as you get closer, especially to this age, to having it written down so you've got that documentation to move forward with these college level exams and even into college. Because once they leave public school and go to college, many of these accommodations will apply there as well. And so you can take the record of what they've been using, and they will have a disability resource center in almost every single college in the state and across the country. All public schools and many private schools as well will have some kind of resource center to work with your child with the needed accommodations. You can submit what they've been using in high school and see if those will transfer. They may look different. They may not accept every single accommodation, but just showing the need that was there can be really helpful moving that conversation forward. So really they'll consider anything, but we just have to show why it's needed and that it's really just leveling that playing field and not rising to the level of, specialized instruction or beyond leveling the playing field. So I know that didn't really answer your question, but that's because it's really not a great answer for the question. It just really is individual as to what that student needs. Okay, so next question. How do colleges look upon ACTs, et cetera, that were taken with accommodations? And do you have information on colleges that are better for kids with dyslexia, et cetera? So
Stephanie, really quick, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. There was another question above that. I just want to make sure that you do get to that one as well.
Oh, no, I didn't see it. Let me scroll up. Our school told us it might be difficult to get accommodations on the ACT since she gets pretty good grades. Is this true? Well, if she's been using the accommodations in school, it shouldn't be true that it's difficult to get the accommodations. Grades and getting good grades should not be the reason not to give accommodations. The purpose of accommodations is not to help a student get good grades. That's not at all why we have them. The purpose is to help them level the playing field so they can learn. And learn in a manner consistent with their typically developing peers, or just level that playing field to the extent that's appropriate for them. So if she has a history of using the accommodation, the school should be able to submit it. And if it's written on a plan, the ACT board, American College Test Incorporated, will, it depends. I can't say that they'll definitely accept it, but grades are not a reason to refuse an accommodation, not by any stretch, because if she needs an accommodation, not all of them are even related to grades. Some of them are related to physical issues through, just their environment, like needing an accommodation in their environment. So no, getting good grades, if she's using an accommodation and using it consistently, that shouldn't impact it at all. How do colleges look upon ACTs, et cetera, that were taken with accommodations? So I don't have specific information on this. I think it might be a good idea to call and talk to their entrance, their entrance people. However, they can't, if you need an accommodation, it's protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you can't be discriminated against because of the accommodation. They can't refuse to accept the student who had accommodations on this test because they were granted by the test. If the board determines that the student needs them, they cannot then say, well, they had an accommodation, so we are not going to let them in. And let that impact them because, like I said, there is that kind of protection. So without having personal experience with that, I don't know that I feel super comfortable giving a solid answer on that, but I think they can't refuse to allow admission because of the accommodation. They just can't do it. They've granted that accommodation. But that's also why it's really critical to get those accommodations before, and not, the school wouldn't administer them without them, wouldn't give accommodations without approval, but it's really critical just to work on getting that approval in advance. And then as far as colleges that are better with kids with dyslexia, I'm so sorry, I don't have any information on that at all. I wish I did. That's something we might have some people on staff that have more experience with that with their personal children, but you could give us a call and we can try to get some better information on that. Okay. All right, so another question that came in, can you ask for accommodations on the standardized end of the year testing that each LEA does each year that the state requires? This might guide parents for what testing accommodations helps their students and what they need to ask for on the SAT, ACT, AP, IB. Yes, so the standardized testing at the end of the year, that's part of the IEP. So it will be written, you've got accommodations, and any accommodation that you're needing on a test should be used consistently throughout the year so that the child, has a chance to practice it and get them ready for those tests. But many accommodations are written into the end of year testing, but not all. And so if there is a particular accommodation your child needs that is not part of that formal standardized testing at the end of the year, you can definitely request that be added in so your child can use it and use it consistently. Definitely. All right, any other questions? It's just about 12:30, but okay, let's see. I was unable to get on the meeting earlier because of technical difficulties, both this time and last time. Will you be emailing us with the information that was covered at the beginning? Yes, we will email you a copy of the slides and also a recording, so you can go back and listen to the beginning. You are welcome. All right, we have about 2 more questions or minutes. Are there any other questions before we end this very quick? It feels like we just started, but this very quick lunch and learn. So this topic is a little bit passionate to me. My son took an AP test last year, and we got accommodations for the ACT, no problem. But at the very last minute, we found out that we didn't have accommodations for his AP test submitted. And so it was a very, difficult and emotional time. And we did get them submit. We got it rushed through. I actually called the college board and said, this is what's going on. Is there any way we can get a rush on accommodations? And they tried really hard to work with me. And we did get the approval the Friday before he was supposed to take the AP test on a Tuesday. So it was just a couple days in advance. But then when he showed up for the test, the accommodations weren't written as part of the test. And so he didn't end up getting accommodations on the AP test. And so that's why I really just want to emphasize, if there's one thing to take away from this, start working with your teams around this time before the tests. So if your child is taking the ACT in the spring or an AP test before the end of the year, or and the SAT, if they're going to take that wherever they may be taking that, start requesting those accommodations or talking to your school about it, making sure that you're signing consent and making sure that those requests get submitted to the appropriate boards now, right about now, or possibly even in November, just so you can get that conversation started so there are no surprises for your child at the end of the day. Okay. It says an accommodation need to be used previously on testing in high school in order to ask for them on college tests. No, because an issue may not even arise until college. An accommodation doesn't have to be, or disability doesn't necessarily even have to be a lifelong disability in order for them to be eligible for an accommodation in college. Or maybe it's something new that wasn't thought of because it didn't arise in high school. So if there's something new that comes up while your student is attending college, have them talk to their disability resource center. It's not called that in every school, but every school will have one. And just have them explain what the challenges that they're having and what they feel they might need as an accommodation, and they can try to get that worked out. But no, it does not have to be used in high school in order to be eligible in college, but it does have to be used in high school to be eligible for those college level entrance exams and college level exams that are happening in high school, if that makes sense. Great question. All of these were great. Okay. All right. Well, we're at the end, but if you have more questions about this, don't hesitate to give us a call, 801-272-1051, or you can email at info@utahparentcenter.org. You can also go to our website at utahparentcenter.org. Like I said, there are lots of other workshops we have that talk about the difference between accommodations and modifications. I realize that the information I gave is a fire hose. There's so much. And that conversation alone is an entire workshop that takes an hour and a half. So if you're still confused about that, it's not, it's not to be unexpected. So, but give us a call. We can help talk you through that a little bit more and help you really prepare, get ready for those college level and college entrance exams for our students with disabilities. Let's have those high expectations and push them toward what they're capable of and what we can do. So, okay, thank you very much. It was great to be with you today. Hopefully we'll see you again for our next in the Lunch and Learn series next week. Bye-bye.